I'm starting this talk feeling a number of regrets. First of all, going after Matthew and his really brilliant and well-presented talk, because I'm going to be telling a far messier and far more historical story. What you've had from Sarah and Matthew in turn are these rather rigorous presentations about how our ideas of the mind and the unconscious have been reconceptualized through introspection. What I want to try and argue today is how the unconscious actually emerges through practical activities, how it emerges through what's happening in history from the end of the 18th century. So whereas my colleagues are philosophers, I'm a historian, and I want to look at the roots of the unconscious in ordinary life. I have a second regret today, and that's partly that Ulf is our chairman, because I've tried to join together Matthew's talk and Per's talk later on William James. So I've set myself a task of outlining 100 years of psychological ideas in 15 minutes. And I'm starting to realize that's probably a mistake. So Ulf, if you interrupt me, I'll probably tail off around 1870 or 1880. So let's see how far I go. My task is made easier because it's a story that's been told many times before. So when people talk about the origins of the unconscious and the background to Freud's ideas, they tend to look back at the history of mesmerism. So from the 1870s and writings of people like Frank Podmore, through the writings of Henry Ellenberger in the 1970s, and more recently people like Adam Crabtree and Leon Chertok, you have a story told again and again that the unconscious emerges, or the unconscious is first discovered in the work of Franz Mesmer, an Austrian physician who's investigated a large number of patients through his discovery of what he calls animal magnetism. This is a really good story, and it's a story that's almost entirely wrong. Mesmer is not engaged in a process that is psychological at all. Rather, he's very much part of an alchemical tradition, and a tradition in particular which sees the body working according to a set of bodily tides. So we have these kind of tides, control over planets, which flow through us, and very occasionally those tides get dammed up or congested, and we need some kind of intervention to undo them. And Mesmer, combining kind of modern natural philosophy with older alchemical ideas, decides that the best way to get these inner tides moving again is through the use of magnets, through the use of large lodestones, which he presses against his patients' bodies, and through this seems to be able to induce in them all kinds of fits, first of all, and later processes of magnetic sleep. So the unconscious isn't something that's being discovered through introspection, it's something that's happening in his medical investigations. But it's not something psychological. It's not unconscious as a noun, as Matthew was talking about. It's unconscious as a state. Okay, so the unconscious is not psychological. What happens with Mesmer, and the way that people have talked about him, is that he's somebody who seems to come up with the right facts in his experiments, but has the wrong theories to explain them. He sees it very much as a magnetic process. Despite that, when he's exiled from Vienna and starts up in Paris, he very quickly becomes a celebrity, he has hundreds of patients, and he starts using a very complex set of materials in order to produce these unconscious states. So Mesmer realizes that the magnetism doesn't just simply exist in the lodestones, it doesn't simply exist in the magnets. He also realizes that he can use his own body to bring his patients into a state of trance, to bring about these kind of transformations. And so in various salons in Paris, he sets up these experiments where he's using tubs of iron filings and copper pipes and stringing people together in long chains to introduce a state of trance into them. So what Mesmer's doing is he's found a set of techniques which are basically bringing back those kind of shamanic states which Angela talked about in her presentation. He's found a technique of bringing back moments of trance and unconsciousness into the salons and worlds of Enlightenment Europe. So it's hardly surprising that his new techniques would cause a scandal. He has a number of medical rivals for his cures, and in 1784, a number of doctors call for the establishment of a royal commission. That Royal Commission, which involves two teams, one from the Academy of Sciences, one from the College of Medicine. The Academy of Sciences team includes people like Benjamin Franklin, Lavoisier, Guillotin. They all get together, they investigate the phenomena that Mesmer's producing, and they try to explain it away as simply an artifact of the patient's imaginations. All these dramatic physical phenomena, the trance, the cataleptic state, the kind of moment of the moment of going into some state of sleep, can all be explained simply through a kind of priming, through simply preparing people. It's what modern doctors would now call a placebo effect. What's interesting in this explanation is by explaining everything through reference to the imagination starts to take on new qualities. It starts to take on different powers in these arguments. So the imagination is suddenly becomes something that's capable of transforming your body, of transforming your health, of putting you into a trance. It's much like the kind of imagination that doctors working on psychosomatics talk about today. So what I think you can argue is that even though Mesmer doesn't really discover the unconscious, it's in the arguments around Mesmer and in the political disputes that he engenders that you see a new idea of a powerful unconscious with the ability to translate, to change our physical bodies or change our characters, first being articulated. And I want to make a very strong claim here. I want to argue that when we look at Mesmer's work, he's not just offering a new description of some hidden aspect of a body. Rather, what he's doing is he's creating a new kind of object in the world. And to make this claim, and I realize there's people who are much better qualified than me to talk about this, I want to go back to ordinary English language philosophy, and in particular, the distinction which many philosophers have between what they call natural kinds and what people call performatives, following J.L. Austin. So a natural kind is something like a badger. You can call a badger anything, it will still be a badger. It stays as it is. A performative is a word that when you use it, it changes the nature of a world. So if I was to say to Matthew, I marry you, he'd become a husband. Nothing's physically changed about Matthew, but it's because of the statement I've used that he maintains that quality. So kingship is another good example. But I can call this badger the king badger. He'll be a king badger if we all treat him as a king badger, if we act like he's a king badger. But there's nothing in the badger that makes him kingly. It's the words we use and the role we give him that changes him. And I think what's interesting about psychological terms is they don't just change social structure. What's clear from Mesmer's experiments is they also seem to change our physical and physiological structures. What we learn to do is embody new forms of trance. So Mesmer sets up a kind of scenario. He gives us a set of artifacts which allow us to enter these trance states. And so I think Mesmer's great contribution is setting up in early 19th century Europe basically a world where we have these new cultures of trance. Like the shamans that Angela described, in the early 19th century, people are falling into trance states once again. Now, of course, this doesn't all come from Mesmer. I couldn't really come to Sweden without nodding towards Emanuel Swedenborg, who through his breathing exercises encourages the practice of trance states amongst his followers in London and in Stockholm. And also, we should acknowledge the work of a turn towards experiential religion, which takes place in the 18th century. So groups like the Methodists are also bringing about moments of trance or ecstatic transport amongst their followers. So something really interesting is happening in modernity, whereby people are suddenly slipping into alternative states of consciousness and embodying them in whole new ways. What's interesting about these new cultures of trance is that they create a kind of world of political struggle. The place where these new cultures of trance are really popularized from 1848 in America through the work of the Fox sisters, Kate and Margaret Fox, is in the new practice of spiritualism, What you see happening from the 1840s and very quickly spreading across Europe, by about 1850, there's 100,000 followers on the east coast of North America. By the 1880s, there's also 100,000 followers in Britain. What you very quickly see happening is trance being practiced amongst a whole number of households in which people are trying to use mediumship to get in contact with the dead. So people are entering a state of trance, or parts of their body are going into a state of trance in things like automatic writing, where they lose control over themselves and they absolve responsibility for their actions. They say, I can't help what I'm doing because the dead are speaking through me. I can't help going over time because the dead are moving my arm or controlling me on the board. So there's a kind of political reality to the claims that these people are making. And it very quickly creates problems. So if you come from a very patriarchal family, the standard Victorian British family, if your young daughter starts channeling Abraham Lincoln and starts saying, I can't do what you say because Abraham Lincoln is speaking through my voice and he tells me to do otherwise, you can see how this is disruptive. And this causes a problem for a number of British elite groups, in particular a group called the Society for Psychical Research. And these are very much the background to William James's work, which Per will be exploring. The Society of Psychical Research say, look, if these trance states exist, the phenomena look genuine, but the people are misinterpreting their experiences. Everything these young girls say, everything they do, in fact comes somewhere out of their memories. And what trance is, it's a state which allows you not to access other worlds, not to access the dead, but rather allows you to access hidden parts of yourself. Very much as Matthias was saying about Plotinus, it's this idea that there's an extended consciousness below the threshold of waking consciousness. And so the leaders are Henry Sidgwick, Edmund Gurney, and Frederick Myers. What they do is that they begin to use all the experiments that had once belonged to spiritualism and to describe the kind of vast continent of the inner life which is trapped inside our skin or inside our worlds. And so what I want to argue is that the subliminal is not discovered through introspection, it's not discovered through philosophical reflection, rather it's discovered in these kind of political struggles within Victorian households, between elite groups, between servant girls, between various people who are carrying out spiritualist experiments at home. Basically, what's interesting, if you go to a start... OK, I'll go back a slide. If you go to a start of psychoanalysis, what we have in place are many different kinds of unconscious. So the subliminal... when people are being investigated, people like Theodore Flournoy in Geneva, his patient, Helene Smith, is channeling different personalities. At one level, she can be an Indian princess. At another level, she claimed to be an alien. Flournoy spends his time trying to trace all her productions back to her subliminal life, back to books she might have read, which might have inspired it, and that she's forgotten. And so what we see taking place in 19th century Europe is a culture of trance making possible the invention of the unconscious, and then with Freud, that kind of the groundwork of the unconscious, the trances which made it visible and investigatable, being kicked away. If you look at Freud's first case history he wrote up, which is Anna O. Anna O is a very striking patient. She's investigated by his colleague, Joseph Breuer. She's a young girl who goes into hypnotic states and speaks with different personalities, depending if she's in the hypnotized state or the waking state. By the time you get to the 1920s, those people speaking with different personalities have all but disappeared. So has a whole world of physical phenomena that had once been associated with trance and the unconscious. So we no longer in the 20th century really see many people with multiple personalities. We don't see people with the grand hysterias where they'd lose control over a limb or a leg. There's a whole world of the unconscious being made and embodied, which disappears by the early decades of the 20th century. But what remains in place is the intellectual framework that had been built upon it. And that is a framework associated with Freud and psychoanalysis that is still with us today. OK, that's it. Yeah.
Do you want an extra minute, sir?
No, that's it. I said today, so we get...
Thank you.
OK.
Wonderful 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Was Freud aware that all this was going on? I mean, was
Yeah,
he
he's all too aware.
consciously building on the experiences of what was going on in Mesmer? Yeah.
And so Freud's a rather brilliant author at kicking over the traces. So when Freud trains in Paris with Charcot, he reads the works of people like Pierre Janet. He reads the works of people like William James later on. He's aware of all these cases of multiple personality, all these cases of hysteria, of these very different models of the unconscious than he has, which see it as to do with many streams and buried layers. And he turns it all into a much simpler story about this kind of Darwinian sexual unconscious, which is breaking out into the bourgeois everyday life of a Viennese home. So we tell ourselves much more restricted and empty stories about our unconscious life than our colleagues did at the end of the 19th century.
Does this apply to Jung as well?
To me?
To Jung?
Oh, sorry, I thought my unconscious. No, I think Jung's much more open in the way that he looks at things. And I mean, Alan's the expert on Jung, and he'll be talking later today. Yeah. But I was talking to Alan last night at dinner, and like one of Jung's earliest cases is Helen Price's work, his cousin, who's a spiritualist. And his work is very similar to Theodore Flournoy's. He's investigating these multiple personalities and how people move between them and how you can try and find traces of those personalities in their memories rather than the other world. So Jung grows up in that tradition, and I think it stays with him throughout his career.